This is Polaris Live. I'm your host, Sarwar KASHMERI, inviting our viewers from around the world to this global series of conversations on the U.S.-China relationship. This program is brought to you under the auspices of the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I have great pleasure today in introducing our next guest, who is Mr. Matt Ferchen, Professor Matt Ferchen, Head of Global China Research at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, also known as MERICS, in Berlin. Previously, professor in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University and scholar with the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, both in Beijing. His research focuses on the connections between China's domestic and international political economy, with a recent focus on comparisons between China's economic statecraft in Southeast Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Please welcome Professor Ferchen. Good morning, Professor Ferchen. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm good, thank you.
I understand you're taking a breather from the pressures of the EU and are in Wyoming.
I am indeed breathing the fresh air here.
Ah, good for you. Listen, I wanted to start by asking you, do you think that the European Union policies vis-a-vis China and American policies, their strategies are in synchronizations? How do you view that?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there are more in synchronicity now than they were just a few years ago. But there are still lots of question marks. As you'll be familiar, the EU now for a couple of years has had this approach of trying to balance the relationship with China by emphasizing three pillars: partnership in different formats, economic partnership, but also on concerns about global governance, competitor or competition, so China as an economic competitor, but also in other realms, and then also as a rival or systemic rival, as it's called. So there's these three pillars, and the European Union and member states are always trying to balance those pillars. Where the U.S. stands is a little less clear. I think maybe under the Trump administration, there was much more of an adversarial relationship, or at least that was what was emphasized primarily. And now under the Biden administration, we get a lot of emphasis on competition and the way that the U.S. should compete. So then there's just question marks about how much the European and the U.S. approaches on these different on how to balance the relationship with China, whether or not there are sort of shared views of how that balance is supposed to work, or what components of the balance are really supposed to be at the forefront.
Well, it's interesting what you've just said, because as I understand it from European newspapers, editorials, just before Mr. Biden took office, they expected that the American approach to China would be a little bit kinder, gentler than that under Mr. Trump, right? So is there surprise amongst the leadership of the EU that Mr. Biden has pretty much followed Mr. Trump's approach towards China? I mean, it's just as tough, no sanctions removed. What do you think?
I'm not sure if there's surprise so much. I think there was a sense that the sort of center point of U.S. policy on China, maybe we call it a consensus, had certainly moved to a much more hawkish, tougher position. So I'm not sure that that's come as a surprise. I think that what was expected and hoped for was that the Biden administration would be more focused on cooperation with European allies.
Right.
And I think that's been true. I think there's still a bit of waiting to see who's going to move first on what issues. And in some ways, the EU moved first with its comprehensive agreement on investment just at the end of last year. And that was certainly seen as a surprise by some in DC. But I think the focus on competition, people are still sort of waiting in Europe to see a little bit where that leads specifically and what that means for possible cooperation with Europe. But I think there was a general sense that the U.S. consensus or sort of focal point on China policy had moved, and that's what we're seeing.
Right. But I mean, is this, in Washington, there's almost nothing, as you probably know well, where Republicans and Democrats agree, accepting this, if I may use the word, real enmity, and so in one sense, competitive against China, right? So, is the same thing in Brussels? I mean, is it as violently anti-Chinese as Washington's elite seems to have become?
I think absolutely not. I think this is really the key question mark still of where the alignment is and isn't on U.S. and Europe views of China. And as much as anything, this question of what kind of a threat or problem does China pose from the U.S. official perspective versus EU level or member state level? At the U.S. level, there's still basically a question of whether or not China is an existential threat to the United States or globally. And there's still a bit of a question mark about whether or not the Biden administration is carrying on that level from that level of interpretation or view of the concern about China from the Trump administration. But certainly the view that China is a rival for primacy, which the United States still has. I think that is something that the Biden administration continues to voice, and that is just not shared in Europe. Europe does not, first of all, have that level of primacy. Maybe there are some who have concerns about the existential threat or threat to democracy or values, certainly on the global stage, but just not the sense that somehow the EU is in a position to thwart China's rise to some sort of supremacy. And this is where the U.S. still sits. And if there's any surprise in Europe, it may be there, but also a recognition that the U.S. just has a different role globally and that its own domestic politics make this a much more difficult challenge than it is in Europe. Again, it's sort of the level of who's the boss.
Right.
This just isn't the discussion in Europe.
So interesting, that whole approach. And I'm just going to ask you, you mentioned the investment treaty, right? I note that China, in this huff of anger, recently put a lot of sanctions on EU parliamentarians who have to ratify this treaty, which is signed in principle, please correct me if I'm wrong. So with this hostility now building in the European Parliament, do you think this investment treaty will actually see the light of day, will get ratified?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the hottest topics of the year for sure in Europe. And colleagues and I and just many others have spent a lot of time in Zoom and other meetings discussing this. I would say at the moment, it's not moving forward, and it won't move forward with any clear pathway for ratification, but there's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of discussions that need to be had in Europe at the European Parliament level and others going into next year. And I think the original idea was that it would be ratified next year. But again, concern that excuse me, that the approach that China took in terms of sanctions was basically going to make this a dead letter. That said, I think it's important to note that businesses in Europe, I think many of them will be moving forward anyway, individually, but also maybe together. There's a lot that they will be able to do, even without the comprehensive agreement on investment. It's more important for some businesses than others. So I think it's politically and symbolically important, and I think it is bogged down and it may not be ratified. But in the meantime, businesses will move forward China will make decisions on its side about what elements of market access it's going to allow to European and other businesses as well.
Well, you know, Matt, what fascinates me, at least from the American side, and I wonder if you and MERICS have given any thought to this, is that there is, on the one hand, this issue of national security, that we need to be careful what we outsource to China, the manufacturing companies, and you know, whether we should slow down the corporate, if you will, knowledge that China is absorbing. But on the other hand, financial institutions are moving into China at a huge rate as China opens up. You know, Goldman Sachs, Morgan, HSBC, all of these people are just rushing in to take advantage of it, since China opened up the idea that foreign firms, financial firms, can have majority control shares. So isn't this kind of does it strike you as a weird kind of situation where half of the commerce is people are saying, you know, we need to slow it down, but the financial piece of it is just moving ahead into China?
Yeah, I think this is certainly something we saw with the CAI agreement in the first place, was that it sort of reflected that at the very least, there are key elements of German business community, but elsewhere in Europe, who absolutely have a desire for more market access, to do more business with China. And if you look at the entire agenda of the Trump administration's trade negotiations with China, a lot of that centered on market access, on concerns about technology transfer, on issues of intellectual property rights. But all of that, if resolved, would allow for more business to be done. So I think what you see is, for a lot of businesses, including in the financial sector, just a long-standing interest in having more market access, being able to do more business. Yes, of course, we have this newer focus on supply chain resilience and discussions about decoupling. But at the same time, just a continuation of long-standing interest in the opportunities that can come from economic engagement with China. And in Europe, again, I think this is where the balance is more obvious, that whether it's at the EU level or member state level, there are just expressions of let's make sure, as we recalibrate the relationship with China to account for some of these concerns, that we also make sure that the benefits of engagement, but also fixing global problems like climate change, are not thrown out as we recalibrate.
I'm going to switch the topic a little bit, if I may, Matt. I'd like to talk about the Indo-Pacific region, because I notice right now, I mean, America's had this freedom of navigation patrols and sailings, where American Navy ships, you know, although they're careful not to go into the 12-mile territorial limit, but they sail through areas that the Chinese say America has to, or anyone has to, get permission to sail through. I noticed that French and German and British and excuse me, even a Dutch Navy vessel are now sailing into those waters. What is the idea of the EU sending warships to join American flotillas in the Indo-Pacific? Is this a more militaristic change in policy? Is this just showing comradeship with the United States? What do you think?
Well, it's a great question, and actually I'd like to throw back at you what you think the U.S. is doing with its Indo-Pacific policies. But there is a renewal of interest in the last few years, since at least 2019, in the concept of the region of the Indo-Pacific in Europe. And it began with France issuing a policy statement about the Indo-Pacific. That was in 2019. Then in 2020, both Germany and the Netherlands issued policy statements about the Indo-Pacific, so strategies about what the countries think is important about the region of the Indo-Pacific for them. And then just recently, the EU issued preliminary conclusions about an Indo-Pacific strategy, which should then be hashed out later this year. So there's this growing interest at the member state and EU level in the Indo-Pacific. And certainly part of that is going to find expression in some of these freedom of navigation operations or naval operations in the region in the South China Sea. But I would say primarily it's not that is the focus. And this is where I think again, whether or not the US and Europe are seeing this from the same point of view or not is an important question. So I think from what I can sense, the EU and member state Indo-Pacific statements and strategies are as much as anything saying there's more to Asia than China. China is an important part of Asia, but there's more to it. So if you look at these statements, there's a lot of emphasis on trade agreements, for example, with Southeast Asia, but also with India, cooperation, for example, on connectivity, BRI, response kinds of things, so building infrastructure in Asia. Just the idea that the region, broadly conceived, is increasingly an economic but also geostrategic center of gravity. But also in all of these statements, there are concerns expressed about rivalry or competition between the United States and China that can potentially be destabilizing. And Europe wants to keep an eye on both the opportunities, but also the potential destabilizing effects in the region. So I think it's really not as much at all compared to the United States of a military or naval focused approach. And I just don't know how this will be viewed then in DC, whether or not that's seen as sort of in alignment with what DC wants or not. But also keep in mind that Japan has been one of the earliest players in Indo-Pacific strategies in the region. And obviously India as a country with a lot of views on this as well.
Well, it just is fascinating. The tea leaves in Washington are not yet very clear, but I noticed already some people saying, well, hey, it's nice of the Germans to send a cruiser to join the flotilla, but hey, what are the Germans doing, calling in at Shanghai and saying, listen, we are not here on a totally hostile mission. This is also a friendship kind of a mission. So I share your puzzlement is too strong a word about what really is taking place. But what I should tell you is that there's a very strong feeling here, and I've picked this up over the last year and a half or 2 years as I was researching my last book on China's grand strategy, that in times of conflict, it is now very, very uncertain whether America can prevail in the Indo-Pacific. And that, in fact, there are a lot of authorities who are saying that in times of conflict, American Navy wouldn't be able to operate within 1,000 kilometers of the Chinese coastline because of all of the anti-denial, anti-access weaponry, space, air, Navy that they've put up there. And I would imagine, and this is a question for you, that the Europeans are not blind to this kind of thing. So I would think that they would want to hedge their bet, especially now, given that transatlantic commerce is actually less than the EU's commerce with Asia at this point. What do you think?
Yeah, I think at the very least, yeah, it's a balancing act. I think these Indo-Pacific statements at the member state and EU level, it's hard not to see them as some sort of an expression nod to DC. Maybe also, these things were underway before the presidential election, that the idea that the EU and also the UK are on board with their own Indo-Pacific strategies, the idea that they are even framing it that way, it seems to me to be a signal to DC. The extent to which there will be careful calibration of naval operations is another issue, but we could also potentially see elements of this in a new NATO focus. Obviously, these will NATO level discussions about China have picked up in recent years. President Biden's visit to Europe coming on the next few weeks. There'll also be discussions about NATO, and I imagine that China will feature in there as well. So I think one way we can understand some of these Indo-Pacific discussions is that there will be at least an eye toward what Europe and the United States, but also allies in Asia may do on the military front. But I think it's also important to note that the EU has expressly noted that they do not view their Indo-Pacific strategies as excluding anyone, and certainly not excluding China. And from what I understand, the German approach to this is actually inclusive of, assertively inclusive of China. So this is not something that the U.S. necessarily wants to hear. So there's certainly a balancing going on.
Hey, Matt, you mentioned NATO, right? And so there's talk now of whether there's going to be a NATO kind of organization in Asia. And I sometimes wonder, I mean, here's NATO, which barely was able to take on a third-rate military power like Libya. I mean, they almost got whipped there, right? Britain ran out of ammunition, things wouldn't fit. Do you think it's even realistic for NATO to be thinking about an Asian strategy, another NATO? I know it's a blue sky question, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's more in the background here as well. I've asked similar questions of friends who work more on these issues. I think one way of reading this is that especially during the Trump administration and concerns that the United States may no longer be supportive of NATO and no longer supportive of the broader transatlantic relationship, the idea that NATO could potentially find new life if there were a focus on China or on Asia, that may be one way of understanding some of this interest. I think we can sort of read that into the broader discussion about where China fits in the transatlantic relationship. Amidst difficulties in the transatlantic relationship, maybe China is a way to breathe life into that. Whether or not there's realistic room for cooperation, I think that it's a rationale for bringing the grouping together. But I agree. I think that there's going to be limited capacity and bandwidth for NATO to focus completely or to shift its mission toward Asia. But this brings us back to concerns about Russia. So maybe the discussions. Okay, let's all have a discussion about the relationship of the sort of the threat and the risk perceptions about China versus Russia, and maybe it all ends up coming back toward Russia, which still is very much on the minds of many in Europe.
Well, I'm glad that there are powerful organizations like the Mercator group that you are in thinking about these things, because, boy, they sure get complicated in a hurry, don't they?
For sure.
I wanted to touch now on this Belt and Road Initiative, right? So it's the China infrastructure program is now in 140 or so countries. But what I'm particularly interested in is that America started out by trying to defame, if you will, BRI by saying this is a program to lend more money to unsuspecting poor countries so they get into debt and so on. And that didn't seem to go too far. So now America set up an organization to actually try and put some money into countries and compete with BRI. What is the European view, especially given that that China has come in to Eastern and Central European countries with BRI programs? This is so-called 17+1 group, of countries that meets independently of the European Commission and EU. Is there a European view of BRI, and what is it?
I think there's at least two levels to it. So a couple of years ago, the European Union put together a package or a strategy for Europe and Asia connectivity. And there is a lot in there about basically a type of European response to the BRI, and that's more focused on Asia, Central Asia, but also linkages to Europe, and a lot of emphasis there on sustainable connectivity, so debt sustainability, environmental sustainability, local community impact, some of the concerns that have been out there about the BRI. So we saw that expressed in this Europe-Asia connectivity strategy, but that's sort of sat on the shelf in Brussels, and there's been frustration in the member states about where that can go. The Indo-Pacific strategy discussions that I was just talking about, they pick up some elements of this connectivity strategy, trying to put some life back into that, and what the European Union can do, but also on its own, but also what it can do with other countries, maybe the United States, but certainly with Japan. There are discussions with Japan about high quality infrastructure and what can be done to raise standards, but also to potentially provide finance for different kinds of infrastructure to compete with China's BRI. But then there's the whole other element which you just mentioned of when the BRI comes into Europe, into Europe in general, but into the EU or near the EU. And then that's where we see the 17+1 framing, clearly a lot of overlap between that and views of the BRI. I think that the general concern has been one of caution the more close these things get to Europe itself. And this is where the 17+1 framework comes in. Certainly a lot of concern initially that this was an effort to split European policies on China, and that needed to be confronted. But in the meantime, what you saw is a lot of policymakers and researchers in Central and Eastern Europe themselves saying, wait, this arrangement isn't necessarily great for us. China promised us the moon, but what have we actually gotten in terms of new investment from China, new trade deals? And I think a lot of people soured on the relationship. And what we've just seen is Lithuania pulling out of the 17+1 framework officially. And in general, I would say the level of concern about how the 17+1 framework, which may be representative of the BRI, is going to be able to split the European foreign policy view on China. I think the level of concern has gone way down about that. Still a lot of concern about where Hungary fits. Hungary plays its own game, both within the EU and with China.
Matt, a 10,000-foot question on the BRI. Do you think that the BRI is an inspiration of President Xi Jinping to extend Chinese influence around the world? Do you think it's that plus making sure that there are natural resources in the future that come to China? Do you think it's a way to spread Chinese ideology in other countries? How do you yourself personally, what are your views on the BRI? Or is it just commerce, business of China's business?
Well, I guess the easy answer is maybe to say it's a bit of all of those things. I will make a plug for the fact that I've written a lot about this, and I continue to write a lot about this, including in the last year. So anyone who wants to see a little bit more of the nuanced views that I have on this are certainly free to look at that. One of the things I think is really important that people don't understand enough is that the BRI is, in a sense, it's a label on top of what China was already doing, especially in terms of its developing country diplomacy. So with regions like Africa, Latin America, but also parts of Asia, it is a label on things it was already doing in terms of infrastructure development, loans for infrastructure arrangements, which were then going to be repaid with oil. Those are sorts of arrangements that also ended up at the heart of the BRI. So a lot of that was around the idea that it's essentially China's way of saying China is here to provide development opportunities to developing countries. That's very much the rhetoric and the framing of it. But it is also what you just said. It's certainly a way of trying to entrench China's business interest, to expand China's business interest, to make China a center of gravity in terms of commerce with all of these parts of the Belt and Road, but also to try to create possible points of leverage for China in case things become more difficult, which they have, including with the United States. The idea that China can create sort of trusted relationships or that it can have leverage in times of difficulty, also including the ability to ensure that other countries don't go against China's interest, or else some of the benefits of the BRI might be withdrawn.
So, Matt, as we head into the closing couple of minutes of this wonderful conversation, I wish you could just go on and on with you. I'd like to end on a positive note. Can you think of 2 or 3 projects that the EU, the US, and China can work together on, and seeing that they're the 3 largest economic groups in the world, and thaw this relationship a bit? Some cooperative projects that we can work together.
Yeah, I think one of them is maybe, again, sort of obvious, is on climate issues. This is one that's already a discussion that's out there. One thing I worry a little bit about is that what you're going to end up with is competitive industrial strategies for, say, green technology. And what you want is some of that competition, but you also want to make sure that the strengths of the US, the EU, and China actually end up producing positive results. So I think that's one. I think another one that's trickier, but where all 3 have an interest, is in a place like Myanmar or Venezuela, where all 3 have a stake, an interest, but also could potentially bring people to the table to resolve really difficult conflicts. And I think it may not be as unrealistic as some may think, that you actually could have some cooperation for all 3 to sit down and solve some really difficult problems that negatively affect all of them.
Well, Professor Matt Ferchen from the Mercator Institute of China Studies in Berlin, one of the world's leading think tanks, we are in your debt for all this time you've spent with us. I wish we could go on longer, but I need to end this program. So thank you so very much for being part of it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure, and